On September 27th, 2023, Valve updated their most popular game to the Source 2 engine and rebranded it as Counter-Strike 2. 1 month later, they released the workshop tools, and right away, dozens of people began tinkering around with the newest version of the Hammer editor called Hammer 5, which, in case you're not familiar, is the world-building tool used to create the maps in Valve games including Half-Life, Portal, and Team Fortress 2. And it was at this time that I started seeing some incredible maps pop up on the CS2 workshop. Impressed by what I saw, I made an entire video dedicated to one called Pool Day. And after looking through the map and learning the ins and outs of Hammer 5, I wanted to do something with it too. So I did, though not for CS2, but TF2. I took Junction, created in the Source 1 engine, and ported it to Source 2. It took 2.5 weeks at about 10 hours a day, but not to worry, I did touch some grass. Now, I'm sure many of you have questions like, why did you port a TF2 map, why Junction, and what about the recent DMCA on the TF2 Source 2 project? Well, to start with the first, I've always been interested in seeing TF2 at a higher quality. I've made several scenes in Blender for thumbnails, but wanted to try porting a map. And until the CS2 workshop tools came out last fall, I had virtually no way of doing this. Yes, there was the Half-Life Alyx engine, but I didn't have VR. There was also Sandbox, but that's a third-party thing kept exclusive to a select few, and I'm not a fan of exclusivity, so that wasn't an option either. So I waited until CS2, and I'm glad I did, because now everyone can see this map for themselves in-game for free through the CS2 workshop, which I'll explain how to do at the end of this video. Now, Junction was a map that I immediately saw had a ton of potential for Source 2. It's fairly small, has a lot of highly reflective surfaces and dramatic lighting, and it takes place underground, making it easy to optimize. Choosing this map to port was a no-brainer, really. Finally, this project has no relation to the DMCA TF2 Source 2 project, and I'm not redistributing any of Valve's intellectual property on third-party platforms, so everything is chill. I will say, however, that an official port to the Source 2 engine is something that I'm totally on board with and hope I get to contribute to if it ever comes. So with all that out of the way, let's look at how I managed to port this map from Source 1 into Source 2. The first step was getting it into Hammer. In Source 1, this is done by decompiling the map from a BSP into a VMF and opening it in Hammer. Surprisingly, you can also open VMFs in Source 2's Hammer, but there's a major issue with doing this due to how the Source 2 engine works. You see, in Source 1, maps are built out of world geometry made from convex blocks. Source 2, on the other hand, allows you to create two-dimensional and non-manifold geometry of virtually any shape. While this gives you more control over your meshes, it makes rendering Source 1 geometry in Source 2 incredibly inefficient because it renders parts of those blocks that you can't even see. This isn't a problem in Source 1 because those faces are automatically erased or culled by the engine. But Source 2 doesn't do this. Instead, it keeps them, which creates many lighting artifacts due to light and shadows bleeding through the edges of the blocks. Fortunately, Valve realized this and created a Python script for converting VMFs that automatically culls and merges these blocks into mostly usable meshes with far fewer issues. So I ran the script and this was the result. Annoyingly, all of the meshes got triangulated, which created some issues that I'd have to take care of later down the road, but in the meantime, I was off to a good start. The next step, which took more time than everything else, was adding all of the materials, because at this point, the map was naked and flashing me with its red checkerboards. At first, I tried using one of several community porting tools, but that didn't give me the results that I wanted, so I started doing everything manually, which is how I'd end up doing most things anyway. So here's how I did it. I picked a spot on the map and shift right-clicked a face to see its assigned material in the bottom right corner. That way I'd know what to port. Then I used the program GCFscape to access the texture files from the TF2 texture directories. In this case, there were two files I had to grab. The first being the VMT, and the second, the VTF. The VMT is a text document that explains how the material is configured. I needed to look at it in case there were any special parameters or texture files associated with the material. For example, this tile floor has a bump map referenced, so I had to grab that too. I'll go over some of the more complex parameters in a bit. Once I had everything I needed, I copied the file structure of TF2's materials to my Source 2 project files and exported the raw images out of their VTF format into TGAs using VTF's batch convert tool, which saved a lot of clicks. I probably could have exported them as PNGs to save on storage, but I overlooked that at the time. The important thing here is that I didn't have to recompress these images back into some sort of VTF, which allowed for a much quicker and intuitive workflow that I could easily integrate with Photoshop. Because even though I was just porting the map, there were extra things I'd have to do in there to make the map pop. Something that I really appreciated when recreating these materials in Source 2 was being able to work within the material editor that comes shipped with this version of Hammer. Unlike Source 1, which had a community-made VMT editor that I didn't even know existed until someone brought it up in my last video. Since this tile texture only has a base texture and bump map, which in Source 2 is called a color and normal map, all I had to do was select this CSGO simple shader and reference the corresponding textures with those file paths I mentioned. However, there is an additional texture map down here that I created for this and every other material used throughout the map called a roughness map, which doesn't exist in Source 1. This map is the bread and butter of the Source 2 engine, for it controls how glossy the material is. In this case, the tiles are very reflective, which is denoted by these darker values in the roughness map. The seams, on the other hand, are not, and instead denoted by these lighter values. To create these roughness maps, I imported each texture into Photoshop, ran it through a black and white filter, and then inverted it to brighten the crevices and darken the flat spots. But most of the time, I had to further adjust the brightness and contrast to match the actual material, since Photoshop doesn't know whether something's supposed to be shiny or dull. This was especially the case for models that used baked textures, because different parts have different materials that should have varying roughnesses. A good example is these consoles. They're made out of what looks to be a semi-reflective metal with plastic buttons and glass displays. Right out of the gate, Photoshop got the first two things right, but left the glass parts rather dull. So I had to select those areas and darken them manually. For this and other metals, like this diamond floor plate, I took things one step further by increasing this metalness value to 0.25, which in the case of this floor plate brings out this nice copper color. You can use an actual texture for the metalness like I did with the roughness, but I didn't find that that was necessary, seeing as most of the stuff in this map is completely metal or not metal at all. There are exceptions though, like this mop and bucket that share the same baked texture file, but as of this video being posted, I haven't bothered creating them. Obviously, if I was recreating these assets for an official release, I would for that extra bit of polish. If you've seen my video TF2 isn't normal, which if you haven't, you definitely should, you'd know that many of TF2's materials use a special texture map called an SS bump map, and that Source 2 doesn't support them. This created a problem because I was left with no normal map for this concrete wall texture, which is what creates these grooves you see in Source 1. Fortunately, a user named Rob5300 created this handy little tool that I used to convert the SS bump into normal maps, allowing us to see the grooves in Source 2. But of course, they don't look the same since SS bump and normal maps are two different things, so that's something we just have to accept. Again, check out my other video for more info on that. Now, this concrete texture has more going on with it than a color, normal, and roughness map, which we can see in its VMT file. It has a parameter called detail that references another texture called detail001, which overlays the base texture to add more detail. And below it, we see that it's scaled uniformly by a value of 1.9. In Source 2, I recreated this by changing the shader to CSGO Complex and enabling this overlay parameter under the detail texture category. Then I added the detail texture just like any other map and increased its scale to 1.9 for both the X and Y axes. We can actually compare how it affects the entire material using this history menu, and as you can see, it makes a big difference. Going back to this consoles material, there's one more parameter down here called self-illum, which stands for self-illumination, and just like the roughness map, it's black and white. In this case, the lighter parts of the texture map make those same areas on the color map glow, or self-illuminate, while the black leaves things unchanged. Source 1 did have self-illumination, but it looks way better in Source 2. I'd also like to quickly point out this siren here that appears to be producing red light. Originally, this model didn't have an on state, meaning there was no self-illumination. The mapper literally placed a red light in front of it and called it a day. But that looked super off in Source 2, so I created a self-illumination map so that it made sense. Now, I'll talk more about the models very soon, but there are still a few more things I need to wrap up with the materials, starting with transparency. The first is materials that have parts with complete transparency, like this metal grate, chicken wire, and fence. In Source 1, these materials have a parameter called alpha test. When paired with a black and white mask, this parameter causes the areas corresponding with the black parts of the mask to disappear. In Source 2, we can do this with the CSGO complex shader by enabling alpha test, and then selecting our color and translucency map. However, this map wasn't referenced in the VMT because Source 1 reads the alpha channel and image files, whereas Source 2 does not. So I had to make the translucency map myself, which I'll explain in a second. To remove the fuzziness around the edges of the mask, I increased the anti-aliased edge strength to 1. Moving on to the glass, there are two different styles used in this map. The first being this classic diamond pattern, and the second being this completely transparent one. This was one of the more difficult materials to port because of the fact that Source 2 doesn't read transparency in color maps. So I made a CSGO glass shader and created a translucency map to define the transparency of the base color. Because of how different the lighting is in Source 2, the exact values of this translucency map were obtained through experimentation. Once I had something I was happy with, I fed a slightly modified version of it into the roughness slot to give the glass a bit of glare. For all of the decals in the map, like the calendars, signs, stains, etc., I also had to create translucency maps to define the negative space. So here's how I did that. I imported the image texture with transparency into Photoshop, turned it white, and placed it over a black background. Simple, but boy did it get annoying after a while. Oddly enough, I came across a decal called Sign 016 that isn't completely transparent on the sides. So I fixed that by adding some black bars. Once I had the translucency map for each decal, I created a CSGO static overlay shader, set the blend mode to translucent, and most importantly, enabled lit, which, similar to the roughness map, does the opposite of what you might expect, because if you don't check this, your decal appears to glow in-game. I didn't touch the normal or roughness maps for these decals since most of them are printed flat, so it'd largely be a waste of time given the final output. One more funky detail I came across that I don't quite understand is this metal hatch. In Source 1, it's placed on this wall, but it doesn't look right because it's placed on concrete when it's supposed to be placed on metal, so I just removed it. The final category of materials I had to port was animated. In Junction, there are only two, the control point hologram and this radar. Starting with the latter, in Source 1, it's classified as an unlit 2 texture, meaning it supports two textures unaffected by surrounding light that can be independently transformed. In this case, the first texture is the screen, and the second is this radar sweep which overlays the base texture with the additive parameter and rotates 360 degrees continuously. All of these parameters you see in this VMT file are called material proxies, which are custom expressions you can write to animate a material in a variety of ways not possible with regular parameters. This also exists in Source 2, except they're called dynamic expressions. Now, I'm not a coder, but these new dynamic expressions seem much more intuitive given the fact that you can isolate them to a specific region, like scale, rotation, scrolling speed, etc. So to make this radar sweep texture rotate, I created a dynamic expression within the rotate parameter that rotates the texture 360 degrees every 7 seconds. But I did this on a CSGO complex shader using the overlay parameter instead of an unlit generic shader with a 2 texture parameter because for some reason my dynamic expression didn't work properly. But I don't think that's a problem given how good it looks in game. A similar case is this control point hologram. It is also an unlit 2 texture, but this time I was able to use the unlit generic shader with a 2 texture parameter. And I used it twice. You see, the hologram isn't just one material. Technically, it's 4 textures. The first 2 being for the logo, which covers the top, and the other 2 for the beam. Since this model is holographic, its materials have to be unlit generic. Both the logo and the beam materials have a dynamic expression for their second texture that makes it scroll up. The cool part about the beam's lines is that it doesn't scroll into the middle because it overlays the color map, which only covers the top and bottom. As simple as this may seem to some of you source junkies, it took me a few days of coming back to figure out. Before I get into the models, I want to quickly go over surface properties. By default, every material functions like concrete. When you walk over something, it sounds like concrete, and when you shoot it, it produces a decal that looks like concrete. This doesn't make sense on things that aren't concrete, so I had to change them. For materials assigned to world geometry, I did this by going to the Attributes tab in the Material Editor and selecting the appropriate material property in this drop-down menu. For the tiles, I chose tile, for the metals, I chose metal, and so on. There are a few special cases, like these metal grates, which have a unique surface property called grate, and this chicken wire, which has chain link. For the models, I did the same thing, but within the model doc, which brings us to the next section of this video, models. To start, I used a porting script from GitHub called Source2 Converter by Redeye to get the models into Source2. I did this by extracting their respective VMTs and VTFs into a separate folder, just like I did with the materials, and then extracted the models. But this time, I had to be a little more careful, because sometimes the names of these files don't match the model, making them difficult to find. To circumvent this problem, I used Half-Life Model Viewer++ by Fitcool to see exactly what materials they called for. Once I had all of the files, I decompiled them with Crowbar, ran the script, and now had an entry for them within the model doc in Source2. But there were still several problems. For one, there was no physics mesh, which if left alone would allow bullets and players to pass through. So I had to add that in manually for each model, which also meant that I had to add a surface property. Next, I added in the roughness, as I've already described in the materials section of this video, and when applicable, remove the ambient occlusion map, because for some reason, it was turning the models black. For most props, this was the final step, but for others, there was a little more work to do. I made the personal decision to add physics to the map, or rather, convert some of the existing static props into physics props, like this can, lunch bag, book, hard hat, and a couple of other things. For these, I replaced the physics mesh file with a physics hull file, re-added the surface property, and when necessary, scaled the mass of the object in the object properties menu to make it move around a little more realistically. The third and final category of props I ported was only a single prop, the resupply cabinet. In TF2, when you run up to one, it opens and resupplies you with health and ammo repeatedly as long as you're touching the trigger. The issue with porting this is that in TF2, the trigger is set to a func regenerate, a special entity that doesn't exist in Source 2. So I had to figure out a way to make it work using map logic. But to keep things organized, I'll talk more about this in the logic section of this video towards the end. For now, I'll just say that I added in the animation files obtained through decompiling the model with Crowbar, which I can preview within the model doc using this timeline. For some reason, the spinning animation for the control point hologram was way too fast, so I decreased its frame rate from 30 down to 4 to match its speed in TF2. There are some more things you can do with it in the model doc, like previewing it in-game, but this isn't a video about the model doc as a whole, it's a video about what I did to port a TF2 map. You can learn more about the model doc and other features by asking in the Source Engine and Mapcore communities on Discord, which I'll have linked in the description for those of you looking to get your hands dirty with source mapping. Now that I had all of the materials and models ported, it was time to do the lighting. For this step, I took many creative liberties, partly because the light entities are different in Source 2. Instead of light spot and ordinary light entities, we have light rect, light omni 2, and light barn. Light rect most closely resembles the Source 1 light spot entity, but has additional configurations for changing the size and shape. You know how in TF2, some of those fluorescent lights on the ceiling have two beams coming out of them, even though the actual light is one long tube? Well, in Source 2, we no longer have that problem. For each light, I made sure to match the size with the prop in the light's object properties menu for the most realistic result. Instead of ordinary lights, I used the Light Omni 2 entities for props that are meant to shine light in all directions, like the 2 fort light bulbs and sirens. The Source 1 version has more of them placed around corners outside of the map, but I replaced most of them with light rect entities because it gave me more control over the shape. Finally, I used the light barn entities in a few spots where I wanted to shape the lights into more of a cone, the most obvious place being Red's locker room, but you can also find them shining on these computers by 2 of the control points. The first thing I did after converting all of the lights was change their color mode from color to color temperature. This allowed me to plug in a Kelvin value to control the color of the light more realistically from red to blue. In this case, a lower Kelvin produces red light, while a higher Kelvin produces blue light. In the real world, fluorescent lights have a color temperature between 4500 and 6500 Kelvin, so I used these values for most of the lights in the map. For the bright red lights, I set it to 50, and in the 2 instances where I wanted a green light, I switched the color mode and picked a green RGB value because it doesn't exist in the color temperature scale. I also tried to standardize the brightness as much as possible to keep things consistent, but because this is a TF2 map, some of the lights are packed more densely or placed farther from the ground, creating light and dark spots. I did add and remove lights in certain areas to remedy this, but ultimately had to tweak the individual brightness of certain lights to equalize the area. For example, these fluorescent ceiling lights in Red Spawn are set to 300 lumens because of how small and reflective the room is, and are set to 500 everywhere else. Even though it was a lot of work, tweaking the lights was actually a lot of fun, and by far my favorite part of the project. But in the Source 2 engine, just having good lights and materials isn't enough to get good reflections. For those, I had to add cube maps, represented by these little balls. In Source 1, you just plop these around and call it a day. During compiling, 6 screenshots would be taken from the origin of each cube map, which would then be projected onto the surface of nearby materials. Source 2 does the same thing, but with a few more features, the most significant being this box. Everything it encompasses gets its reflections from the box's cube map and is parallax corrected, meaning the reflections adjust to your position similar to how they'd look if they were being ray traced in real time. For this port, it was a huge improvement, especially since there are a lot of highly reflective surfaces throughout the map. However, everywhere where the map wasn't just a boxy room made adding these tricky, because if I just slapped them down next to each other, they'd create obvious seams and look bad. So I tried my best to avoid doing that, but in some areas, I had no choice. One remedy was adding more of these metal frames wherever 2 cube maps met. Another was fading the edge distance to make the seams more subtle. Overall, it was a very cumbersome task, and it's a little frustrating knowing that the reflections aren't perfect, but I did the best that I could, and hopefully you're all satisfied. One more trick I did was manually assign reflections from one cube map to an object that was getting its reflections from another, like this truck. I figured its specular highlights could be a little more pronounced, so I added a second cube map above it, named it, and assigned it to the truck in its Object Properties menu. Comparing it before and after, I think it got a lot better. At this point, I was mostly done with the visuals, so it was time to move on to the logic, starting with the doors. These function the same as in Source 1, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about them, but I will explain how they're hooked up. The 2 doors that go out to A, and the first door towards B, start closed at the beginning of the round. After 30 seconds, this logic timer fires an output to this relay that unlocks and opens these 3 doors. While the one at B stays open permanently, I changed the 2 over at A to open and close when blue players pass through them. The biggest reason being that they're the boundary of 2 different cube maps, so when the doors are open, the reflections on either side don't match. Over at A, these 2 outer doors are configured the same way, which is with a trigger multiple brush entity that makes the doors open when someone starts touching it and close when everybody leaves it. Now, one of the differences with doors in Source 2 is that they don't have the same sounds as the ones in TF2, so I had to find and extract those sounds from the TF2 sound directory, edit their length and volumes, and reference them in the door's start and stop close sounds. Lastly, all of the outer doors are filtered so that players on blue side can't enter red spawn and vice versa. Now that the doors were done, I moved on to the control points. Because this branch of Source 2 was made for CS2, there aren't any game rules or entities for TF2's game modes, so I had to make the points work using map logic. The first thing I did was create two material groups for the control point, one for red and one for blue. That way I could make it change colors after capturing. Then I took the obsolete team control point entity, duplicated it, and turned the duplicates into the red and blue holograms. When the map loads, this logic auto entity disables all of the blue holograms, leaving the red ones. Then, when you capture the point, this relay disables the red, enables the blue, and changes the color of the control point from red to blue. I also threw in some sounds, which I'll explain in a minute. Now, the way that this capture progress works is as follows. When you enter this trigger, this logic relay is triggered, which fires all of these outputs for capturing the point, and then kills the trigger exactly 5 seconds later. But if you leave the trigger for some reason, it cancels the progress on the relay. Technically, this isn't the same as in TF2 since there's no progress conservation, but I don't even know if that's possible, which is why I went with this. This is all for aesthetics and immersion anyway, so it's not a big deal. Capturing the point also changes the color of these capture point signs from red to blue, but not in the same way as the control point. For whatever reason, the skin input that I used for the control point doesn't work on the signs, so I had to duplicate each, change them to blue, and make the logic auto entity disable the blue ones at the start. Then, when each point is captured, its respective relay disables the red signs and enables the blue ones. I even did this for the final point even though it marks the end of the game for continuity. Also, in case you haven't noticed, the signs read capture point instead of control point. For whatever reason, Junction uses the wrong version, so I went ahead and switched it over to the correct one. Now, just like in TF2, you can only capture the last point after the first two. To implement that, I added a math counter entity with its maximum value set to 2. Then, when A or B is captured, it adds 1 to the entity so that after both points are capped, it fires an output to the C trigger that enables it. I also made one that fires after the last point is captured, but I didn't know what to make it do, so I left that relay blank for the time being. Earlier in the video, I said that I was going to explain how these resupply cabinets work in the logic section, so here's a breakdown. When you touch this trigger, 3 things happen. First, an output is sent to this point server command entity that gives you a health shot and replenishes your ammo. These other 3 outputs are run at the start of the game and configure the health shots so that they heal you fully and faster, and change the carry limit to 1. The trigger's other output tells this point client command entity to play the regenerate sound, but only to that particular player. Finally, these last couple of outputs control the animation of the cabinet such that when someone starts touching it, it opens, and when everyone stops touching it, it closes. Alright, so that covers all of the map logic except for one thing: sound. Up until this point, I've only mentioned how I grabbed the sounds from TF2 and added them to various things, but the exact procedure is somewhat complicated. There are different types of sounds and different ways to play them, all of which require separate parameters and entities. The first set of sounds revolve around the control points. For each point, I created 4 point sound event entities that play out of this info target. They're hooked up to this trigger to play the different capture sounds. But to add these sounds, I had to not only extract the audio files from TF2's sound MISC directory and throw them in the project sounds folder, but also create an entry for them in the sound events add-on file. Here, I used different parameters to control each sound's volume, falloff, and directionality. There are some other parameters for controlling reverb and attenuation, but trying to modify these gave me errors, so I left them alone. Since we want the control point sounds to be directional, I set their type to CSGO Mega. For the siren that plays when the round starts, I used A and B looping stereo bass to make it sound like it's coming from everywhere. Don't ask me why they're named this way, that's just how the example presets were configured when I copied them. For the falloff, there's this distance volume mapping curve with 3 groups. The only values I changed were the first 2 lines of each group. For the sound that plays when you're capturing a point, the volume is set to its max at a distance of 0 hammer units, then falls off halfway at 500 units, and finally can no longer be heard at 1000 units. The audio level in between these distances is interpolated for a smooth falloff as you move away from the sound. These point sound events were the most straightforward since I could control their sound origin using an info target and source entity name parameter. And in the case of the doors, I didn't even have to place an entity. But the soundscapes were their own beast. To make these guys work, I had to not only create a parent entry for each soundscape in the sound events add-on file, but add entries for children's sounds in all the places that I wanted to emit local sounds. For example, I wanted this computer on the left to make one sound and the other one on the right to make another. To make this happen, I had to add a line for each child specifying its coordinates and falloff. That's one of the reasons why I added these info targets. I could get the coordinates I needed within its transform properties and use it as a reference. That way I could know if, where, and what sound I placed at any given location. They're not actually connected to anything like with the control points. Once all of the children were created and the soundscapes were complete, I had to place these environment soundscape entities above each door where I wanted the soundscape to change. For example, the soundscape inside of Red Spawn plays a humming sound to represent all of the fluorescent lights, and as soon as you leave, it changes to another soundscape that plays computer ambience. Now, the sounds don't match the Source 1 version at all. I included and excluded certain things from the original, and added sounds for every computer except for the gray ones. Overall, these changes should give you better immersion compared to Source 1. Now that everything was basically done, it was time to debug, but I'm not going to show each individual issue because I've already fixed most of them, and it'd take a long time. But there are a couple of things I can go over real quick that I had to do. First, I had to take every transparent mesh and mark it as not a viz contributor, because if I didn't, the engine would interpret them as walls and hide everything behind them for optimization. The map porter did a remarkable job doing this automatically, which we can see by hiding everything that doesn't contribute to viz. There are some black spots that become leaks after compiling, but unlike Source 1, you can still compile maps in Source 2 even if they have leaks. They can create issues with visibility and optimization, so it's preferable that you patch them up, but in my case, they don't cause any issues. Still, I might fix them anyway in a later patch. Remember how I said that the map porter automatically removes the sides of blocks that you can't see? Well, it was quite aggressive and ruined all of the windows and other parts of the map where different meshes were touching. So I copied the blocky meshes from the version I ported without the script for these areas. I also used them in areas where the triangulated meshes were creating lighting and reflection seams, which there were a lot of. I'm actually quite pleased with how well things turned out considering you can't even notice where I did or didn't fix these meshes. At this point, the map was ready for a final compile, so I ran one with 4K resolution light maps at final build quality and things looked great. But I wasn't done yet. There was one final thing to do before uploading the map to the workshop, which was my second favorite part of this project, post-processing. In Source 1, post-processing is possible through two entities, Environment Tone Map Controller and Color Correction. But the Color Correction entity is hardly ever used, and the Tone Map Controller only controls the bloom and exposure. In Source 2, we can do a lot more. Within the asset browser, I can go to the post-processing editor and create a custom vpost file where we can conduct a lot of operations similar to Photoshop. By default, it starts us off with this tone mapping layer, which I personally didn't mess around with, but you can see how these presets affect the lighting. The first thing I did was add a brightness contrast layer and increase the contrast. Then I added a slight orange tint to add some warmth, and finally finished things off by adding some bloom. I also added an orange tint to the bloom to give the light some temperature. The bloom is very important because Source 2 doesn't have those spotlight entities from Source 1 that create those fake volumetric beams. There are surprisingly a lot of parameters here, but I chose not to stray too far from the defaults because I think they work well. There's a lot more you can do with curves, saturation, color balance, etc. that have a lot of potential for maps with different biomes or dimensions. But for Junction, I wanted to keep things looking natural. So there you have it, Junction in Source 2. If you want to check this out for yourself, there's a link to the map on the Steam Workshop in the description. Just go there, click subscribe, and it should show up under the Workshop menu in CS2. Now, I'm gonna be real with you all. I had a lot of fun with this project. Source 2 is a beautiful engine that allows you to do so much more than Source 1, and seeing how TF2 could look if properly ported is fascinating to me. I know people don't really talk about it that much, but I genuinely believe that a Source 2 port would revolutionize this game and allow for a ton of new content. I know this is going to sound cliche, but Valve, if you're listening to this, please give a Source 2 port some serious thought. I'm sure many of us, myself included, would love to be a part of that. Thank you for watching. This is LED switching off.